Okay, so here we are today, spending some time to delve a little bit further into the nervous system and breath. We're here with Jack Feldman, distinguished professor of neurobiology out of UCLA. And firstly, would like to start by acknowledging you, Jack, and thanking you for your time. It's a pleasure to have you here, and super excited to dive into this conversation with you as a discussion, and at the end to open up some time for the opportunity for the group to pose some questions. This is the Our Breath Collective Breath School group, and we've been, as we mentioned, spending the last 2 months diving into anatomy, physiology, and now more of a focus into the nervous system. And with our chunk of time in the last module, we spent 4 hours diving into the neural origins, which is at the core of your work, looking at the preBotzinger complex, into the parafacial nucleus. We spoke about the phrenic nerve, and then started to dive a little further into themes of autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic, sympathetic, and its relation into this theme of the social nervous system. So Andrew Huberman has also been a great inspiration and mentor of ours. He sends his regards, and so at that, would love to kick off the conversation with you, and kind of hear some words into really where this all started for you. I know you've spoke about that in some of your previous lectures and talks, but just to give the group a sense of familiarity around your perspective and how this whole evolution began.
So I started out, I actually have a PhD in physics, and I was, when I was in graduate school, it was during the late 60s, and there was lots of experimentation going on with perception. I probably don't need to elaborate what that meant, but I got very interested in the perception of space and time. As a physicist, I was interested in the conception of space and time, but got interested in the perception of space and time. And one thing led to another, and fortunately I was at a university that was very ecumenical about being able to study the brain while still being a graduate student in physics. And my advisor got very nervous when I told him I was interested in the brain, because he said, it's too complicated. And I'll only let you work on something you can solve. So I looked around, and I thought breathing would be trivial, which the typical physicist hubris. It's basically, I thought, a problem of how the brain generates a simple oscillation. And he allowed me to do that. And I did some theoretical work just with pencil and paper. And not being satisfied with pencil and paper, I went out to try and do experiments. And so I went to a lab. One of the leading labs in the world studying breathing was in Paris. So I sucked it up and went to Paris for 2 years. And it was a great experience. And I realized that breathing was not as simple as I thought it was. And been working on it ever since. And as I was telling Sam, I spent a lot of my research career trying to figure out the very basic mechanisms. I mean, breathing is extremely robust. You don't suddenly stop breathing. You're breathing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, probably 600 million breaths in your lifetime. And so what is it about the nervous system that allows you to do that? At the same time, you can have voluntary control over it. You change it very rapidly. So, when you think of something that's extremely robust, very often they're sluggish. So, if you have a big block of concrete, it's very robust. But if you want to move it around, it's not very easy to move it around. And breathing has that robustness, but how does it have that lability, the ease with which we can move it around? And the way the nature has solved it turns out to be extremely complicated. One of the, can I show a picture or two? Sam, can I have the screen? Oh, okay, I have the screen here, great. If you just indulge me for a second, I just want to show you a simple figure. Let me see if I can get it. Okay, so when you think about a watch, you think about something that's a very simple oscillator that goes around and around and around. And if you want a simple explanation for it, you say, well, I just have a spring, a coiled spring, and the spring unwinds. But that's not what a watch looks like. This is what a watch looks like. And it's extremely complicated. And why is it so complicated? Well, it's complicated because it's not just moving the two hands around in an arc. It's moving them very precisely. It's being able to adjust the hands if it gets out of alignment or you go to a different time zone. You want it to last for hours, if not days, and you want it to withstand shocks and so on. And so, okay, I want to end my. So it turns out that the underlying mechanisms, which many people have thought are just like that simple spring to drive two hands of a watch, it turns out when you start looking inside, it's complicated because breathing is not just moving the diaphragm, it's moving all these muscles. It's doing it extremely efficiently. It's about 7% of your total body metabolism at rest is for breathing. And you can think in an evolutionary sense that as vertebrates and mammals evolved, the mammals that breathe more efficiently, more likely to produce offspring because they didn't have to get as much food. They could survive periods without food. And so if you look at the energetics for breathing, we're typically at the minimum at rest. Now, once we start increasing our need for oxygen, the equations change because there are other things we may want to begin to optimize, like in exercise. But we're always keeping that in mind. We want to minimize the energy. So that's another boundary condition that makes this thing very complicated. Now, for things that interest how breathing might affect other functions, breathing is coordinated with a lot of things. You coordinate breathing with swallowing and chewing, with speech. So here I am speaking to you, and you probably don't notice when someone talks to you that they're actually pausing every couple of seconds to inhale some air, otherwise they would pass out. And how am I coordinating that? How am I adjusting that so my oxygen and CO2 levels remain about the same? I mean, to me, it's amazing. And then we have all these other functions that seem to be coordinated with breathing. Your pupils oscillate with the respiratory cycle. Now, why? Well, maybe I can try and explain that to you, but it does. Your fear response. So if I showed you fearful images, your response to them is going to be greater during inspiration than expiration. Now, why is that the case? We don't really know. I mean, when things are done in an evolutionary sense, it's hard to explain the why, but I may be able to sort of give you an idea about why that may have happened. Our reaction time. So, if you're an athlete, if you have reaction time, if you're a boxer or a martial artist, when do you throw your punch? When is your opponent's reaction time going to be the longest? Well, it varies with the respiratory cycle. So if you watch their breathing cycle, you know when to pounce because they'll be a little bit slower if you go at a particular time. Now, humans have known for thousands of years that by controlling the breathing cycle, they can have profound effects on emotion, cognition, state of well-being. And we now have, more modern approaches to this, like Wim Hof, who has found a variety of very particular breathing techniques that seem to have a very profound effect on certainly some people. And it's bona fide. I mean, it's real. The question that one of the questions that I'm interested in now is why? Why is that the case? And when we think about breathing, we have this rhythm. And clearly that rhythm is present in the parts of the brain that are driving the movement of the muscle. So the preBotzinger complex, which is the engine, is initiating this rhythm, and it gets transmitted ultimately to the motor neurons, which are the neurons that leave the nervous system and go to the muscles like the diaphragm and intercostals and abdominals. So we have this rhythm. Now, over the past decade, neuroscientists have realized that the breathing rhythm is not just in the regions that are directly associated with driving the breath, but are all over the brain. They're in regions like the hippocampus, which is important for memory. They're in the regions like the prefrontal cortex, which is important for what's called executive function. Almost everywhere you find this breathing rhythm. And you know, you could say it's epiphenomenal. That is, it's not really doing anything. But we've not have enough instances of studying the brain where we see something and we say, oh, that can't be doing anything. That's just an epiphenomenon. And we find out that it actually is doing something. And we think, and there's lots of good data now, that the breathing rhythm is actually doing something. So, Sam, am I being too long-winded here? I mean,
No, this is great, Jack. Thank you. So we ultimately did a very broad unpacking of breathing matters. The study discussing the preBotzinger complex, looking at that as the primary engine driver for inhalations, and an introduction to the parafacial nucleus with active expiration. And as you've discussed, talking about the burst neurons, I'm curious if you could speak to the neural circuit network that is communicating between those two brain regions, and to give the group an opportunity to delve a little further into those neural origins and what's happening there with the burst neurons as there is activity happening before the signaling of the actual motor movement of breath. And then we'll continue to delve a little further.
You guys are really advanced. I'm very impressed. So we thought forever that there would be one oscillator, like you have one engine in the car, that there'd be one. And you know, we see oscillations that really have one source, like day and night. Day and night don't come from two separate sources. They come from the rotation of the Earth. It's one oscillation, and that produces these two different phases, day and night. And we thought forever that when we found the preBotzinger complex, it was responsible really for both inspiration and expiration. And then we did some weird experiments. And the weird experiment was we gave a little opiates to young rats. And what happened was they stopped inspiring, but they began to actively expire. So we as mammals actively inspire and relax. We inspire and relax. So we use active use of the diaphragm and the external intercostals to increase the volume of the thorax, and that causes the lungs to expand. And we didn't pay any attention to expiration. We just thought it naturally followed from the absence of inspiration. And then we had this weird result where we suddenly had the rat breathing with active expiration and relaxing. Now, this turns out the way amphibians and reptiles breathe. We have a diaphragm, which is this amazing muscle. And but reptiles and amphibians don't have a diaphragm. And so the way that they are able to move their lungs is by their chest compressing and relaxing. Now, when they do that, they can move air, but they can't move it as efficiently and as well as we can with a diaphragm. Once we had a diaphragm, we became inspiratory breathers. And as we became inspiratory breathers rather than expiratory breathers, at rest, we stopped generating expiratory, active expiratory movements. That is, the expiratory airflow was just the passive relaxation of the diaphragm, the rib cage, and the lung, which is like a balloon which you inflated and just relaxes back. And we have completely neglected what was well known to pulmonologists, that at rest, expiration is passive. That is, you're not using those expiratory muscles, you're not using your abdomen, you're not using your internal intercostal. But that when you need to generate more air movement to get more oxygen in and more carbon dioxide out, that you start using your expiratory muscles. Now, the reason we're not using them at rest probably is an energetic consideration. That is, it's more energetically efficient just to use your inspiratory muscles rather than both your inspiratory and expiratory muscles. So that was something that we observed, and we didn't believe it when we saw it, but it turns out that it was bona fide, and that there was this second region that turned out to be the expiratory oscillator. And these two oscillators normally talk to each other. They don't normally couple. But one thing that's unusual about them is that the inspiratory one is opiate sensitive. So you all know about this unfortunate public health problem of opiate-induced death. We call it opiate-induced respiratory depression, or OIRD. And I think this year it's going to be, or in 2020, it's like 80,000 deaths. Now that arises from the fact that there are opiate receptors on the preBotzinger complex neurons. Why? It has nothing to do with pain. Opiates, or endogenous opiate molecules, were present in the nervous system well before they were used, or we knew about pain relief. And then humans found out that there were opiate receptors on neurons that were important for transmitting pain. And if you ingested or took opiates, they blocked pain, and they became very potent painkillers. In fact, they're still amongst the most potent. Unfortunately, the receptors are also on the preBotzinger complex. So one of the things that happens if someone overdoses on opiates, and part of the problem is now that the natural opiates like morphine and heroin are relative. Oh, sorry. The naturally occurring opiates are not as powerful or as strong as the synthetic ones. So fentanyl, which is commonly used for surgery, is about 100 times more powerful than morphine, but it's still manageable. But these synthetic opiates like carfentanil is 10,000 times more potent. If you ingest a pure carfentanil the size of a pinhead, it will stop your breathing. And this is a serious issue that has not only public health official worried, but actually the Homeland Security is worried because it could be used for a terrorist attack. You disperse carfentanil in a crowded place, and a lot of people are going to stop breathing. And so there's a desperate search now to try and find ways to reverse that. And we could talk about this because the normal drugs that could be given for normal opiate overdoses, like naloxone and naltrexone, don't really work for carfentanil and its relatives. So it's I don't mean to give people, make you have sleepless nights, but it's something that's keeping a lot of people, including me, awake at night, trying to understand that. In any case, it was through opiates that we found out that there was this second respiratory oscillator. And under normal conditions, when one is active, the other is inactive. And there's it's what we call reciprocal inhibition. We can actually contract expiratory and inspiratory muscles at the same time. We do that all the time, called the Valsalva maneuver. If you go and you grunt, what are you doing? You're contracting your diaphragm, your abdominals, squeezing the subdiaphragmatic viscera, pushing up on your diaphragm. And every time you defecate, and you're trying to force the solid matter out of your anus, you're generating a Valsalva maneuver, because that's the way you can squeeze down on your large intestine to push out the fecal matter. So you can co-contract. They're not always inhibiting each other. Now, as far as these bursting neurons go, the ones that are ultimately transmitting the signal to breathe, it turns out that they're not only going to respiratory muscles indirectly through the motor neurons, but they also project, instead of going down towards the spinal cord, they also project upwards towards the brain. And we found that there was a specific projection going to a region called the locus coeruleus. And that was a pretty amazing finding that really has to be credited to Kevin Yackel, who was at Stanford at the time. And what we found was that these neurons don't seem to have a particular effect on the breathing per se, but when you deleted the neurons that projected up, which you could do by some molecular magic, you get a situation where the animals appear calmer. So we think this is one of the ways that signals related to breathing get up the circuits that affect breathing, affect emotion. Now, I probably should make a comment about that. We know, and you guys are experts in this, that these breathing patterns that we generate that are not normal can affect our emotional state. How does that happen? Well, there are about 5 or 6 different ways that can happen. One is through a direct projection from preBotzinger complex to regions either directly or indirectly that affect emotion. So you can have a projection going to locus coeruleus. Locus coeruleus projects everywhere. It can go to a region called the parabrachial nucleus. That goes to a lot of regions affecting emotion. So we have that ascending signal. We have an olfactory signal. That is, every breath, unless our nose is occluded, we have air going in and out of our nose. That creates a signal in a region called the olfactory bulb, which is getting these signals from the olfactory mucosa. And it turns out the olfactory bulb also goes everywhere. We know the profound effect of different odors on behavior. Something that's pleasant can be very relaxing and calming. Something that smells bad can be very stressful. And there are also pressure receptors, that is, receptors that are simply responding to airflow. If we block the olfactory system, some of the breathing related signals that are found in the brain go away. So there's an olfactory component of this. And so there are some breathing practices that emphasize breathing through the nose. And the signals, a lot of the signals there are going into the olfactory system and then projected up. I should also say that not only is the breathing basically indirect, because basically you're moving the air through the diaphragm and the air is going in and out. So that's not a direct neural projection. There is a projection from the preBotzinger indirectly into the olfactory system. So you have this conversion of the breathing modulated olfactory signal coming in from the nasal mucosa, an essential signal that's going in. So that's 2. A third source is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is this huge nerve coming from the brainstem, going down and innervates all of your viscera. It's what's called parasympathetic, and Sam says you guys have studied that. The parasympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system, usually associated with things sort of calming down. The sympathetic is sort of fight or flight kind of stuff. The parasympathetic calms you down, slows your heart rate down. Um, Now we know that electrical stimulation of the vagus nerve is very effective in treatment of refractory depression. We don't know why, but people who don't respond to drugs or psychological or psychiatric verbal treatment can often respond positively to stimulation of the vagal nerve. That signal goes in and then has its effect. Now, the thing related to breathing is a very important component of the vagal nerve signal coming into the brain is coming from receptors in the lung. There's an important class of receptors that are simply responding to the lung expanding. So if you record from the vagus nerve, you'll see activity increase with inspiration, decrease with expiration, increase. So you have this respiratory modulated input coming in. We know that there's powerful reflexes with respect to breathing. So one way that your brain knows, or your preBotzinger complex knows that breathing is being effective is that as the signal leaves the preBotzinger complex, it goes out to the diaphragm, the lungs inflate. The signal from the lung goes back into the brain to the preBotzinger complex saying it's working. And when you get to a particular volume, it helps shut it off and it helps stop inspiration. Now, if you don't have the vagus nerve, what happens is your breaths tend to be deeper and slower. That is, the preBotzinger complex has the capability of generating its own rhythm, but it's a little slower and deeper. When the vagus nerve is intact, it cuts it a little bit shorter, so your breaths are not quite as deep, and you breathe a little bit faster. So that's another way that signals related to breathing come in from the vagus nerve and could ultimately influence your emotional state. So that's 3. A 4th is the blood gases. And Wim Hof talks about this. That is, if your body likes to have a certain level of oxygen and a certain level of carbon dioxide. It turns out that at rest, you're mostly regulating to keep the carbon dioxide level within a certain narrow range. The reason being is that carbon dioxide levels are very important in setting pH. And all your cellular metabolism is very sensitive to pH. So neutral pH is 7.0. Alkalotic pH is higher than 7, and acidic pH is lower than 7. Normal human body pH is about 7.4. That is with slightly alkalotic. Now, you want to keep it close to 7.4, and there's a very tight relationship between the amount of CO2 that you have in your bloodstream and your pH. And so if you happen to hyperventilate, which is hyperventilation just means you're blowing off, well, let me backtrack a bit. Your breathing is regulated such that you blow off as much CO2 as you're producing per minute. You're producing about 200 milliliters of CO2 per minute, and out of the air that you expire, 200 milliliters of that is CO2, and that's very tightly regulated. Oxygen is not that quite that tightly regulated at rest because of the way hemoglobin carries oxygen. So you're normally at about 100 millimeters of mercury, but at 100 millimeters of mercury, you're about 98% saturated. That is, your blood is carrying 98% of the amount of oxygen it could carry. But if you go to 95 millimeters of mercury, it'll only drop maybe 1%. If you go to 105, it might increase to 98.5. So reasonable swings in oxygen are not very critical for the amount of oxygen in your blood. Whereas if you have a 1 millimeter change in carbon dioxide, which is normally at 40 millimeters of mercury, your breathing will go up 40%. So you're very tightly regulating CO2. So things that are going to change your CO2 level can now affect your pH, and that's going to change your brain function. So some breathing practices, including some that Wim Hof talks about involve changing your CO2 levels, either hyperventilating or hypoventilating. That's going to change your CO2. That's not a breath, so much a breath by breath change, but it's a sort of a longer lasting change. And that can affect your brain function also. Now, another thing that can affect your brain state related to breathing is the volitional command. So when you change your breathing, you're doing it by explicit changes in your breathing pattern. You're sending signals from your motor cortex down to your preBotzinger complex to drive your diaphragm either faster or slower, or deeper, or whatnot. Those signals that are coming from your motor cortex can radiate. We call it efferent's copy. That is, there are efferents coming down and they can go other places. And those going to those other places can affect your emotional state. Now, there's one other thing I'd like to talk about, and that's related to the emotional aspect of breathing. And there is a very devastating stroke which occurs, which causes what's called locked-in syndrome. It's a stroke which occurs in a part of your brainstem, sort of back here, that blocks the axons, the signals coming from your cortex that travel down through your brainstem, that go to all your muscles of your neck, your face, your limbs, your torso. When that happens, individuals continue to breathe. And the reason they continue to breathe is that that stroke has occurred above the preBotzinger complex. So the preBotzinger complex still remains connected to all the machinery for breathing. So these people, when they have the stroke, don't die from asphyxiation. They survive, but they can't move. They can't do any volitional movements. They can usually move their eyes laterally because those neurons controlling the lateral movement of the eye are unaffected by the stroke. And so that's one of the reasons it's called locked-in syndrome, because they can follow you around the room. This does not affect their intelligence at all. They maintain full cognitive function. They simply cannot move. But let me tell you there's a qualification for that. So I had some colleagues studying a patient who had locked-in syndrome, and the patient could communicate with their caretaker by blinking. And the patient was breathing normally, but it was very robotic, very just steady state. He asked the patient to hold his breath. The patient could not hold his breath. They asked the patient to breathe faster. The patient could not breathe faster. If they gave the patient a little carbon dioxide to breathe, their ventilation went up. And so they could regulate their breathing, but they had no control over it. And suddenly the patient's breathing changed dramatically. And they said to the patient, "What did you do?" And the patient, blinking their response, said, "You guys told the joke and I laughed." And in fact, every time they told a joke that the patient found funny, the patient's breathing pattern went to the sort of the stereotypical inhale, ha, 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 ha kind of thing. And, you know, it's very interesting about laughing. It's very idiosyncratic. We all have different laughs, and we all know people who have these very weird laughs, but they're very stereotyped. That is an emotional laugh. You're controlling your breathing apparatus, not by volitional, because that pathway remains intact in the stroke that causes locked-in syndrome. It means that the axons are going down through a different part of the pons to affect your breathing pattern. Now, we know there's a lot of emotional control of breathing. If you ask a patient with locked-in syndrome to smile, like if I ask you to smile for a picture, you say cheese or you do something. Anyone looking at you know you're not smiling because you're happy. And a locked-in syndrome cannot make that kind of smile. But if you show them a picture of something that, like a loved one, they can smile. And we as humans, primates, can read facial expressions really well. A lot of our facial expressions are not volitional, they're emotional. If you happen to play poker, you know about tells. Tells are not volitional, they're coming from this emotional part of your brain. Oh, I got a great hand. Oh, I got a lousy hand. You have a one-up when you play poker. Read your face. You're trying to maintain a poker face where he's reading your face saying, I got a sale here, because that's how they're expressing it. I also believe that great actors are able to, when you ask me to smile, you can tell it, I'm faking it. Great actors, you actually believe it. And I think that they have some special way of mobilizing the emotional control system to do those smiling or unhappiness that most of us can't do because we don't have those pathways. Now, I don't know whether they were born and have special pathways or they just learned how to do it, but they're different than certainly I am. So those are some of the pathways by which breathing practice can influence emotional state. Now, with a particular breathing practice, right now we don't know. I'm working with a group in the psychiatry department at UCLA, and we have a proposal for a fairly substantial research grant from the National Institutes of Health to actually get at this, to try and find out how this is happening. Now, for me, what I'm trying to do is to teach rodents breathing practice. That is, if I can get rodents to breathe slow on command, and we're making progress in trying to do this, then I can see whether if I get a rodent to breathe slow on command, whether the result is that the rodent becomes calmer. If I put the rodent in a stressful situation, which has been studied by neuroscientists and psychologists for 50 years, are they more relaxed? Are they more resilient because they've been breathing slower? Now, one of the motivations for doing this is that there are ways we can investigate what the mechanisms are in rodents that we can't investigate in humans. And if we can understand some of the mechanisms in rodents, we can then design experiments, for example, by using imaging in fMRI machines to try and get at it, and then maybe find therapeutic ways of manipulating it. For me, my feeling is I believe that breathing practice works. And as many of you know, we have lots of friends and colleagues who are skeptical, if not cynical. And I think it would be a great benefit to a lot of people who are under a lot of stress from everyday stress and people who have more clinical problems with depression to realize that this could be helpful. So I feel if I can demonstrate that this is the case in rodents where there's no placebo effect. If I do an experiment on you, we have to worry that there's a placebo effect because you know that you're supposed to be calmer when I do the experiment on breathing practice. My presumption is that the rodents we have in the lab don't know they're supposed to be calmer. And if we can demonstrate that in rodents, then humans might say, maybe there's something to it, and more of them may be open to actually trying it. And as you know, it can have enormous benefit that doesn't involve pharmacology. It doesn't involve practices which are dangerous or might have serious side effects. So I'm trying very hard to see if that's the case. Now, it's also possible that we evolved to do this and rodents just branched off that branch of the evolutionary tree before that happened. So I'm very open-minded about it, but I really do think that we will see something in rodents. Sam, I'm now open to
fascinating.
questions.
Thank you, Jack. And it continued to remind me, we've discussed breathing as a movement from fascia with primary breathing muscles, talking about breathing as a behavior. Thinking of my standout was this summer I'd walk behind my grandmother in the kitchen and she doesn't hear very well, so she'd go, and looking at all these ways that breath shows up as an actual behavior and how that can subsequently impact our state of being. And so I'm curious then to look at then where and how does somebody get almost stuck in the rut as you've depicted metaphorically, neurocircuit wise? Is there something that's happening in throughout the course of somebody's life experience that they take on and adopt certain breath behaviors that then evoke a certain state of being, and then into the essence then are in breathing re-education and breath practice, is it just that we're creating a deeper connection between brain and body and more versatility to shift state from moment to moment? As we know, breath is liable and every breath is unique in its own.
Very well put. There's a well-described phenomenon for which they gave the Nobel Prize more than a decade ago, where the connections between neurons can get strengthened or weakened. This is called long-term potentiation, where it strengthens, or long-term depression, where it weakens. And one of the key factors which determines that is that activity sort of repeats. And if it repeats, it tends to strengthen. Or it can happen if there's convergent input. If two things happen at the same time, then the connections strengthen. If they happen with some delay, the connections can actually weaken. So when it comes to a behavior that is repetitive, it tends to get locked in. And for something like depression, metaphorically, it's not a motor movement for depression, but mentally, it's something that is constantly repeating. And so the kind of connections of the neurons that underlie that sense of depression get stronger and stronger and stronger. And they can get so strong that you can't pull them apart. If they're weak, you can disrupt them. But if they get so strong, it's very hard to pull them apart. And we can disrupt them by heroic measures like electroconvulsive therapy, where you give this huge electric shock to the brain, and that temporarily disrupts them. And for depression, it seems to transiently work in relieving depression. Of course, that's pretty heroic intervention. Deep brain stimulation is a little bit more targeted, but it's still pretty heroic. But given that breathing rhythm is almost certainly present in these circuits, and these circuits work on the basis that there's this background breathing rhythm. That's how they work. It's there all the time. And so if you just change the breathing rhythm, and I don't know for a fact whether there's any particular way of changing the breathing rhythm that's more effective than another. We know that through practice, for example, slow breathing seems to work, but rapid breathing could also very well work. I'm very ecumenical about that. What that does is that this background on which the signaling is going on now gets disrupted. And if it gets disrupted long enough and often enough, what happens is the connections begin to weaken. You get this long-term depression happening. And if it happens long enough, it can basically dissipate. We even see this for a single breath. I mean, if you're nervous, you're at the top of a double black diamond, Sam, and I don't know about you, but I would be quite nervous. I would have to take a few deep breaths to calm down, and I would calm down. I mean, it really does work. When I go to give a talk in front of a large audience, I get a little bit nervous. And, just a few deep breaths. I don't have to meditate for 5 minutes, a few deep breaths. And I think this is one of the roles that size play. I mean, we know that size play a role in maintaining lung function, but size play an emotional role when we're stressed we tend to sigh. And I think one of the reasons we sigh when we stress is because it actually tends to relieve the sigh transiently. And so I think that it's doing that because it's transiently disrupting that circuit that is producing that increased sympathetic activity, which is making the heart beat faster and whatnot. And so you're disrupting the sympathetic activity, you're probably increasing parasympathetic activity. All these things we're trying to understand the circuitry for and the mechanism. But I think for the public at large, the best service that I think I can do is to convince people that breathing practice really works for everyone. And you know, that's sort of what I'm in, and trying to discover the mechanisms is what I've been fascinated by my entire life. So it's a lot of fun for me and extremely educational. I mean, I can't wait to, you know, do the next experiment.
Amazing. And that seems to be a key within the whole process, is the curious mind and the openness to question. I know you've been challenged and scrutinized over the years, and the courage to continue that counts. As we now, I see this as the forefront, and this whole collective continuing to come together. And in the sense, I feel like you answered my question as the study we were discussing last week, the review into sleep apnea, Patrick McEwen's work, and really that then breathing is non-prescriptive, and how we can meet an individual where they are. And so I'm looking to take a step back as to then how this whole group can start to look at those that they're working with to give them a tool that's going to allow them to start building their capacity. And thus my question initially was whether within all of this research you've done, and your theories about breath, whether specific breathing patterns matter. And
you know, you may not like this answer, but I am I don't know. I mean, one of the things I found that is very important for me as a scientist is to admit my ignorance. Because if you fake your knowledge of things, you don't ask the right questions. So I don't know. Now, there may be data out there that is very definitive. And when I say I don't know, that is likely in ignorance. I have not seen anything that's convinced me that any one particular practice is going to work better for everyone. You know, if you've heard some of the previous podcasts, I think if someone doesn't have a breathing practice, is to try and find a breathing practice that they can repeat. You know, it's like exercise, and you know this. If someone is a couch potato, you can't say, okay, go run a marathon. You're trying to get them to find something that they can do, that they find enjoyable, then they can repeat. And then if they try, well, it's not challenging enough for me, or it's not working, you try and find something else. So when I'm asked, I say, look, try and find a breathing practice that works for you. You know, if slow breathing works for you, then try slow breathing. If breathing through one nostril works for you, then try that. You know, and then see if it has an effect. You know, it may not have an effect. And you know, part of that is you have to convince people to be open-minded about it. If they come into it and say, oh, it's bullshit, forgive my language, and it's, you know, it's these weird people doing this, then you have a major barrier to climb. But if you can get them to be open-minded and to give it a shot, they will find out that, well, not everyone, but many of them will find out that there are some improvements, and that if they keep at it, they may see more improvements. I think, you know, I try not to oversell it. I try not to proselytize. I say, look, I do it, and I find it helpful. And that's, I'm sorry, Sam, that I can't give a particular prescription, but that's sort of my thinking about it now.
I love that, Jack. Thank you for that perspective. And I think it's really powerful for this group who are all coming together to now be able to go out and share these practices with people. And I think that is part of the challenge is how do you get someone who's skeptical to try it? Or how do you get someone to keep it going? And that's really the basis of what we've done with our Breath Collective is creating practices for people to keep coming back to. So I guess that leads me to my question for you. Do you have your own breath practice? And if so, what do you find helpful for you?
Well, what I find is I try mostly every morning before I get out of bed, I will take 10 minutes and just concentrate on breathing slow. So if normally you're breathing 12 breaths per minute, I'll go to 6 or less breaths per minute. I'll do it for 10 minutes and I'll feel totally re-energized. If in the middle of the day, I feel sort of a postprandial depression, I will stop for 5 minutes and do that. I found it very helpful and even life-saving pulling off the road when we used to drive long distances, and you sort of get a little bit tired. I would pull off the road and breathing practice for 5 or 10 minutes, and I'd be totally re-energized. In fact, when I used to go into the lab every day, very often at lunchtime, before I would restart my afternoon, I would take 10 minutes to myself and just meditate. And that's, I think there's good data. If you look at people's productivity, after lunch, it often declines. But if they take a few minutes to themselves, meditate, breathe, it's re-energizing. Now, I've not gone much further than that, but it works for me. At some point, I may increment it, but I'm not going to cut back. Now, gentlemen, this is great. I'll say would be thrilled to do this again or have a follow-up, to welcome questions. Sam has my email, so I'd welcome questions. I'm delighted to do this again. Like all of you, I'm busy, but right now it's only an hour. I mean, one can always find an hour. So I'm happy to do this again. One of the reasons is that at 4 o'clock, I have a Zoom call. It's one of my grandson's birthday. So I really don't want to be late. So I don't mean to be rude. I don't mean to rude. This is delightful to have the opportunity to talk to you. I'm sorry I've been so dominating of the conversation. I would have loved to hear more feedback. But Sam, we can do this again. I'd be happy to do this again.
Thank you, Jack. It's been a pleasure. And I know the group's hungry and probably excited with some questions from all this info that you've shared. So I'd love to, we'll be in touch, and Reese and I will share this with the group as well. Luke as well, who's on here, is one of the leaders of our Breath Collective. And
hey, Jack, it's my legal name on here, but nice, really an honor and pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much.
The pleasure's all mine, and it's great to meet you guys. I'm a little jealous of where Sam is, but that's life. I'm not unhappy. I'm not unhappy, and I think it's great that you're doing it. And I think you guys are doing a great thing. And if there's anything I can do to be informative or helpful, please don't hesitate to ask.
Jack, are you in California?
I'm in Los Angeles.
In LA, okay. And are you in New York, or are you from the Boston area?
I'm from Brooklyn.
You're from Brooklyn, okay.
If you want to hear the Brooklyn,
I hear it. No.
Yeah, my kids make fun of me all the time, and I could tell you the Brooklyn alphabet, but we probably would get arrested. So.
my dad's from Queens, so it's familiar.
Okay, well, Queens is not Brooklyn. We Brooklynites stand together.
Well,
Okay,
Jack,
Sam,
thank you so
I'm going to
much.
run. I apologize. You guys take care, stay healthy, stay sane, and breathe deeply.
You as
Thank you
well.
so
Keep
much,
to the
Jack.
breath.
Thank
Well,
you, Jack.
we'll have the group get some questions together, and hopefully we can find a time in the coming weeks, depending on your schedule, for more of a robust Q&A style from everybody.
That would be wonderful, and I look forward to it. So take care until next time.
Excellent. Happy
Thank you.
birthday to your
All right.
grandson. Thanks,
Thank
Jack.
you.
Peace.
Awesome, everybody.